And thanks so much for joining us today for this very special dialogue event on the outlook for Peru's troubled democracy. Next Sunday, on June 6th, Peruvians will vote in a presidential runoff to choose between the leftist union leader and teacher Pedro Castillo of Peru Libre and the right-wing former lawmaker Keiko Fujimori of Fuerza Popular. According to the latest polls, the race is extremely tight and could go either way. Although we will not discourage predictions about the likely outcome, our discussion today will focus on the dynamics of this race, how the campaign has evolved, what to look for in the final days, and how the campaigns and the countries are expected to take the result on June 7th, and what we are likely to see in the period until July 28th, when the next administration is scheduled to begin. How did Peru end up with such a choice? Two candidates who are widely rejected by most voters. The fact is that in the first round on April 11th, some 80% of the Peruvian electorate either voted for another candidate or in blank. We will explore different scenarios. What would a Fujimori or Castillo government mean for Peru, for its already precarious democracy, for governance, its economy, its critical social agenda, international relations? Will a country so ravaged by the devastating effects of the pandemic be able to find a way to recover economically and achieve a measure of political stability and social peace? Fortunately, we have three superb speakers to help shed light on these and other questions. I will engage in a conversation with them before we open it up and invite your participation. Let me introduce them briefly, and you can find their full impressive bios on our website. Adriana Urrutia is the president of the Asociación Civil Transparencia and the director of the Professional School of Political Science at the Antonio Ruiz de Montoya University in Peru. We are very grateful for Adriana's participation this morning at her first dialogue event, I believe. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Alberto Vergara, another political scientist and a professor at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, prolific writer, essayist, commentator, and a good friend of the dialogue. And finally, to Mike Reid, who's the Bello columnist and senior editor for Latin America and Spain at The Economist, the author of several books, just finishing another one now, I understand. And his first book, which many people may not know, was actually on Peru, a country where we met and became friends some 35 years ago. And it's always a pleasure to have Mike with us as well. Encourage you to follow this event on Twitter at #ElectionsPeru and at The Dialogue. And we invite participants to submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom or to email questions to meetings@thedialogue.org. Before getting started, I want to thank my colleague Gaston Ocampo for coordinating this event. Adriana, let me start with you. You're on the ground in Lima working hard. Please give us your sense of the dynamics of the election, what you think is driving and shaping the race. Will voters decide while they're waiting in line next Sunday at the polls? And also be interested if you could share a little bit about what the role of Transparencia, your organization, is playing in the election, and also what you believe is at stake for Peru's democracy. Adriana, welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and I will thank the dialogue for my first invitation here. So I am really grateful to share today some thoughts with my colleagues. We have around 5 minutes, right, Michael? Is that right? The time we were given? Right. Perfect. So I will start with, I wanted to share some maps because I really think that we need a territorial perspective here. So if Gaston, if you could able me to share my screen, I will appreciate, please. Thank you. So I think this election could be read on an inequality key. So these are the results, territorial results for the first round. Here we can see two Perus. one from the south and the Andean zone is here in the center, and the other, well, Lima and some coastal departments, and of course the forest region from Loreto and Ucayali. Here are the results for the first round that are very similar to the results in 2016. For the first round, you could see here the results for Frente Amplio in 2016 is the south. The left is south, as we used to speak here in Peru, and a north that were more like close to Keiko, the last election. And in 2011, the map was similar and very close to the map this year for the first round. So what we could see here is some territorial perspective of the vote, and this has to see with some inequalities and the face and the challenges that the democracy in Peru has faced to guarantee some rights. I wanted to share with you this map that is already, you could see monetary poverty, and it's exactly the map that the voters for Castillo in this election. And here you could see the IDH, that is the same dynamics. No, so I wanted to just focus on the dynamics of inequalities in the country and how it is translated in a political option for the election. The COVID crisis has a strong impact. You could see here how poverty has strength in some areas. For example, in rural areas, we are coming back to where we were 5 years ago. In Lima, we are coming back where we were 12 years ago. And in urban areas, we were going back where we were 12 years ago. In Lima, 13 years ago. So we have I will say a critical change of inequalities and reinforcement of inequalities that of course translate in political option. If we see where people are voting for Castillo or where people are voting for Fujimori, we see that Fujimori has a strong option in Lima, and Castillo has a strong option in rural Peru. So that was just the idea I wanted to share, and I wanted to answer Michael's question about the role of the association that I lead, that is Transparencia. Transparencia is a civil association that was founded 26 years ago in 1994 for defend democracy and put democratic, I would say, guarantees in the public agenda. So weeks ago, we were working with the church and religious association that are the most, I would say, not most important, but the institution in which people has the most confidence. It's not the public institution that people trust in Peru, but it's the church. So we were with religious association and to promote what we call Proclama Ciudadana, Juramento por la Democracia. That was a document in which both candidates commit to respect and guarantee democratic aspects. So many people from outside Peru told us why both candidates has to swear that they will leave the power 5 years after, why they have to swear to respect the other powers. So this is the situation. We do not have the guarantee that both candidates will respect democracy once they will be in the power. So I'm my minute number 6. So maybe we could continue after. I have many things to say, okay, but thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Adriana. That was terrific, and thanks for getting us off to a great start. Really, really helpful, and the maps are really, I think, quite instructive. Let me now move to Alberto. And Roberto, I guess the question for you, one of the questions is, how did we get here? Peruvians facing choices they don't really like, and they're not very happy with, a very polarized situation. What do you see, as possible scenarios? I mean, what's going to happen given the dynamics that we've seen in this campaign over the last few months? Where is this? Where do you think this is headed?
So you think I can see the future, right?
Well,
yeah, I'm not a Michael J. Fox coming from the future to save anyone. So thank you very much, Mike. It's always a pleasure to be in the dialogue, and great to have to share a panel with Mike Reid and Adriana Urrutia. So Adriana, I think, has helped because she's presented this more territorial, structural, economic way of seeing this election. So maybe I can move to directly what is happening in the second round, and maybe I will not have time to explore the scenarios, the future scenario, but maybe we can. But I think it's important to understand what is happening now, because it's going to shape what the future in some way. So how did we get here? Maybe it's a way of starting is to try to define what do we refer by here. And I would say that here is a situation characterized by a country at the crossroad. So at the crossroad, because you have on the one hand this huge crisis that partially Adriana has explained, so economic, sanitary, and also I would add politically. I mean, the last 5 years we had 4 presidents, 2 Congresses, and so it's at least it's a manifold crisis. But that crisis these days meet the worst runoff that anyone could imagine for the country. A formidable crisis would require actually a formidable supply of candidates to attempt to put the country in a new and better direction. But that will not happen. I mean, the mood in the country reflects this dramatic crossroad, a country where the deepest crisis meets light, irresponsible candidates. And what is paradoxical is that despite knowing this from the rational side of things, the Peruvian society has fallen into the trap of a dangerous polarization. So 2 candidates, I mean, Mike Shifter explained this, 2 weak candidates reaching the second round. And despite this, the society getting into polarization, as they were like 2 titans of politics, right? So we're in the middle of a harsh, damaging campaign, even with episodes of violence, but in order to elect someone unfit for dealing with the challenges ahead. And the weakness of Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo are several: their authoritarian tendencies, their irresponsible economic promises. I mean, all that, I think it's known, and maybe I can focus on something a bit less said these days, and that's the problem of, I think, the radical problem of legitimacy that they will both carry if they are elected. I mean, Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo have refused during this campaign to cut ties with the negative sides of their candidacies, right? Castillo never had a clear action separating himself from Vladimir Cerrón and his radical program. Keiko Fujimori never attempted to distance herself from what Fujimorismo means, and even established an entourage pact with emblematic Fujimoristas character from the 90s. Therefore, both candidates actually decided to win or to lose, but remaining faithful to their authoritarian origins. So by refusing to adopt a more democratic stand, they transform this runoff in a competition in which citizens, we are invited to decide, who do you fear more, communism or Fujimorismo? And hence, a good part of Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo electorate for the second round will be conformed, I mean, any of them winning the election, the electorate that voted for them will be conformed by people that would never voted for them in any other circumstance. Half, I mean, this is not joke, this is not an exaggeration. According to polls, half of the Keiko Fujimori vote says is voting for her only to stop Castillo. So this means that from the very first day, even people that voted for them will feel disgusted with whoever is the president, even in their own voters, right? Popularity will not be one of their assets for sure, and especially in the case of Keiko Fujimori. And this satisfaction, I think, will increase when any of them, once in power, attempt to rule being faithful to their authoritarian impulses. So let me finish on this. But now the problem is that this campaign, fear is in the air now, right? They have pushed the country to a second round based in threats and fears. And the result is that the losing side will be aggressive, regarding a government that will be perceived as an enemy that puts you in danger. And whoever is in the government will reply with violence, right? Because that's why we know that the politics of fear tend to generate policies of violence. I mean, it's the argument that Martha Nussbaum did in a book from a few years ago. Fear is a good sentiment to cement a monarchy, but a poison to build a republic. But now we're full of that poison, a poison that, I suppose it's needless to say, but prevent any possibility of constructing legitimate and enduring policies to tackle one of the worst crises in our history. So I think this is this part of the campaign will have an effect on how any of these governments behave in the future.
Great. Thank you, Alberto. Mike, I want to follow up on some of the points you made, but why don't I turn to Mike? And you've been following Peru very closely, tracking developments for 40 years. The country extremely well. Welcome your thoughts as well on sort of how we got to this point, and also kind of any thoughts about is there a way to kind of are things as bleak and as gloomy as Alberto paints them? Is there a path for one of the candidates, whoever wins, to sort of be a reasonable performance and hold things together, and all that's been gained in Peru, despite all the problems that we're aware of? Do you see a way that could happen?
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel. And it was kind of you to mention in the introduction my first book, which was published in 1984 and was called Peru: Paths to Poverty. Sadly, I fear, and Adriana mentioned this, that it's acquired a certain relevance, again, that title. But we should remember that for most of this century, that was not the case. Peru is a country that in comparative terms in Latin America was doing very well in many ways, in terms of economic growth, in terms of poverty reduction, and the problems were not so much with the economic model, but with the state and with institutions. And there were lots of things that needed fixing in order to create a fairer and society and a more effective state. Now, what has happened, and I will really date this from the 2016 election, is that Peru has seen a process of political destruction and conflict that has aggravated greatly the discredit of the political class. Then came the pandemic. And yesterday, the Peruvian government just almost tripled its official death count to 180,000, which in per head terms is the highest in the world. one fears that it will be overtaken when proper counts are done in other parts of the world. But the pandemic exposed inequalities, incompetences, frailties in Peru, and did further damage to the political system. And so I think a large number of Peruvians are very angry, and with reason. Now we've got to this election, which highlights some of, in extreme form, I think, some of the current problems of Latin American democracy. The first round, fragmentation, in which there were, whatever it was, 16, 18 candidates, and clearly none of them infused Peruvians. Castillo got 19%, and that was the most. And in the second round, we're seeing another problem of Latin American democracy in its current state, again in extreme form, and that is polarization. And Alberto referred to that. I think both candidates, sadly, pose a threat to democracy. I think both have a serious credibility problem. I mean, it's very hard for Peruvians to know whether they can believe them in what they say, In Castillo's case, because he keeps changing, and in Keiko's case, because she has a record. Castillo clearly represents a cry for social justice, but could he deliver that? He represents a hardline Marxist party, and it's not at all clear what the division of power between candidate, or if he's elected, between president and party would be. It's not clear who would advise him. He's probably the least experienced and least well prepared candidate to get to a runoff, well, certainly that I can remember in recent Latin American history. And I think he poses two big risks. One is that he tries to buy popularity and uses that to deliver on the promise he made to call a constituent assembly whose purpose would be to take all power, over all institutions. And I think the other risk, which is more likely, I think the first scenario is impossible but improbable. I think the second scenario is that Peru faces, under President Castillo, incoherence, desgobierno, drift, conflict, and economic crisis. And in those circumstances, he might not last terribly long. Now then we come to Keiko, who is a damaged, diminished figure compared with her last two elections, campaigns. And she showed herself to be an immensely destructive figure when she had a majority in Congress from 2016 to 2019. As Alberto said, she hasn't made a clear move to the center. She could get more easily than Castillo a majority in the new Congress. And I think she could form a more coherent government. But I see two risks with Keiko. One is that she, despite her promises to Adriana on transparencia, that she behaves undemocratically, that she tries to capture the judiciary and other independent institutions in the name of private interests, some of them murky. And I think the second, and actually probably greater risk, is of great and potentially unmanageable social conflict. And I would fear that the Peruvian street, Peruvians take to the streets as people are doing in Colombia, as they did in Chile and so on. And again, the government might not last the full 5 years. Just to finish, a year ago, I wrote a column recalling that in the 3 years after the Wall Street crash of 1929, which was the last economic slump on this scale, or slightly smaller, but big scale. In the 3 years following that, in 8 countries in Latin America, civilian governments were replaced by military governments. History doesn't repeat itself. Circumstances are different. The armed forces are different. But I think one has to say that democracy in the region is at risk. I think that's true in Peru. Does it have to be like that? No, it won't necessarily be like that, but it depends on Peruvians finding ways to come together after the election, which will be a big challenge. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mike. Let me turn back to Adriana and just follow up and really taking off what Mike just said. Since from your perspective, from Transparencia and on the ground in Peru, are you worried that on June 6th, next Sunday, that the elections, that the results won't be accepted? Is it, how serious of a concern is that?
Yes, absolutely. We are just about to publish one comunicado, as we said, recalling both parties to recognize the results. And I am afraid that we won't have definitive results on Sunday, since as the polls shows the last week, the results are very close. So I think we will have to wait at least 2 or 3 days to have the definitive attendance and the definitive results. So both parties, we will, if the results are not very different, both parties, we will call into the fraud. So, and I think this is risky for democracy and the confidence that the citizens have in the country for democracy. So this is the first one, I will say the noise around the fraud, and particularly I want to highlight some attacks that the president of the National Election Jury, Jurado Nacional de Elecciones,
right,
has been directed to the president of this institution, accusing him of having a communist past. So they are preparing the ground in order to criticize this institution and the legitimacy of this institution, that is the one that definitely validate the results. And there are also attacks to Piero Corbeto, who is the other leader of la OMPE, la Oficina Nacional de Procesos Electorales. So we are in a very tense situation in which both electoral authorities are criticized. So this is like the context, the preparation of a context for speaking on fraud and for don't be able to recognize the results. But I would say we are also concerned on like 2 other democratic risks. The first one is the dynamics on between the Congress and the Parliament, because neither party, once arrived to the power for the executive, will have a majority in the Congress. So the relationship will be very tense between the Parliament and the executive, exactly as the relationship has been these past years. So we won't have political stability for the 5 forthcoming years, and this is a risk because we need to improve some reforms in order to get the country out of the, as my colleague says, the political and the sanitary crisis. So how we're going to be able to guarantee some universal rights as education in Peru. I don't know if many of people who are attending this know, but in Peru, those schools are closed since March of the last year. So it's going to be 2 years of schooling that hasn't been presential. So we have also an educational crisis. So how we're going to retribute these universal rights to the citizens if we do not have political stability, and we won't have political stability. So the light at the end of the tunnel is like very, very far away.
Yeah. Thanks. Let me just follow up one quick question to you. I mean, do you see, there have been in recent days, and I want to ask Alberto about this too, but there have been in recent days, sort of some signs. I mean, Keiko Fujimori said yesterday that she's she asked for forgiveness and all of this. I mean, is this, do you have a sense in the final days when the race is so tight that these kinds of gestures or acknowledgements make any difference to voters who are still undecided? Or I mean, what is that? What are you looking for as that could sway, in one direction or another?
The numbers say that 1 out of 5 Peruvians decide their vote in the same day of the election.
Right.
So we have, this week is critical to decide the vote, but I guess many people have already decided the vote, and the vote, as well, also Alberto and Michael said, is not I would say it's not I wouldn't say rational, because there is a rationality, but it's not like based on some principles shared with the candidates or some like gestures of the candidate that has been approved. It's basically what kind of model we are ready to accept. Do we want to stay with the model, or we want to change the model? And that's why I was talking about inequalities, because it depends on which side are you of this society that you're going to decide the vote. So I will say that the decision remains in Lima and how Lima is going to vote. And the campaign has been so violent. So I would say like people still thinking, but I don't assume that like the changes are going to be like huge for the final results. So I think we are going to have like very tight results, and many Lima will going to say which candidate is going to win, as previously happened before.
Great, thank you. Alberto, let me turn back to you. You talk to a lot of, you're invited to talk to a lot of business groups in Peru. What is, are clearly there's greater sympathy and support for Keiko Fujimori than for Pedro Castillo. But I mean, first of all, do you see the concerns that Mike Reid identified with the Keiko presidency in terms of, of great conflict and polarization and, by the business community? Do they have reservations about a Keiko Fujimori presidency, or are they all kind of identify with her? And do you see any possibility that a Castillo administration could do some things by getting people on its team, experts and economists and others, that they could gain the confidence of the business community? Is that conceivable at all?
Well, I think, Mike, that it is. I think it has changed during these almost 2 months between the first round and the second round. My sense is that early after the first round, the business community were, of course, afraid about a possible Castillo government, but there was not panic. And I feel that that has changed, right? The polarization and the fear of the other has increased, and now there is a sense that it's deeper, I would say, in the fear regarding Castillo. And again, it's what I was trying to say in my first intervention. I think it's damaging, the fact that this long time between the first round and second round polarizes people in that way. I mean, because now it's like the whole conversation turns around what we are going to do, is the conceptualization of the other as an enemy, and I'm afraid that this doesn't help for what's coming, because my sense is that democracy in Peru, weak as it is, will only survive. I'm not even thinking about strengthening, right? But will only survive if actors make democracy survive. This is not a moment in which we can trust or depend on the rules, the institutions. I think the dynamics about a brutal way of doing politics were unleashed several years ago, and we're dealing with that, and we have to deal with that. So it is very important that the actors in Peru, political, business, citizens, know that there are tools in our political system to make democracy survive. I mean, don't start to think about maybe a coup can save me, maybe anyway, right? That kind of thought that unfortunately or also, I totally agree with Michael Reid when he was saying, I mean, one possible scenario will be disorder, desgobierno, right? And I'm afraid that, again, the radicalization of these days will push, especially if Keiko Fujimori is in power, will push her to act, to behave in an authoritarian way, because there will be the legacy of the fear. I mean, something that I think has changed is that now I feel that that the right-wing part of the spectrum in Peru will be so afraid that if Keiko Fujimori loses power, we will have again the threat of the communists, that they will support whatever she does. That's my main concern right now, that the fear to Pedro Castillo, communism, and his voters will remain, and therefore there will not be critic. Much to the contrary, they will be tolerant with a possible Keiko Fujimori authoritarianism, or authoritarian, at least not as a regime, but at least as practices, right? So that's my concern, and I think that has changed because of this long period of almost 2 months between the first round and the second one.
Mm-hmm. One final question on you mentioned Vladimir Cerrón. I mean, how significant is he, and is it fair to judge Castillo on Cerrón? And we've seen lots of examples in politics that in many places where just for pragmatism, that there's taking some distance, and you said that hasn't happened, but could you imagine that happening, and that Castillo would sort of become a little bit more independent and separate from Cerrón, or is that just impossible?
I can imagine that perfectly. I mean, it's as you said. I mean, Lenin Moreno regarding Correa,
Right.
President Santos regarding Uribe,
Right.
And right. So that has happened. So it's not impossible. But I feel that Castillo is a very precarious candidate. I mean, it's hard to imagine a weaker candidate for the presidency of a country like this, like Castillo. Politically, intellectually, I mean, on Sunday in the debate, he was not even able to fulfill the minute and a half he had for speak about the different subjects. So I feel that he knows that he should separate himself from Cerrón, but at the same time, we don't know if he cannot or don't want to separate from Cerrón. But in any case, so far he's not been able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mike, let me turn to you. And I just want to sort of pursue this always, which you mentioned, but the great paradox of Peru, which has been sort of, good economic performance and terrible, gloomy politics, dreary politics, which has been around for a while. And, I think every elected Peruvian president since the mid 80s has been credibly accused of, has faced corruption charges. So this has not been a long stretch. Despite that, at least until the pandemic really hit, the Peruvian economy was moving forward. How can you imagine? I mean, China is now is for years now the largest trading partner of Peru. Peru has a free trade agreement with the United States. Is all of this could be at risk? With given what we're facing with the results of Sunday's election and the next administration. I mean, is it the end of this sort of coexistence of relatively sound economic performance and bad politics? It looks like we can't, we're not too optimistic in this group about the politics getting better, but can the economy kind of continue to perform reasonably well despite what's happening?
Well, let me start by putting it the other way around. I mean, if you imagined that Peru could have political stability over the next 5 years and a moderately coherent government, I think the economy would bounce back quickly and quite strongly, because commodity prices have risen, especially copper, because thanks entirely to President Sagasti, vaccination is now it's moving forward. And the signs in the numbers are that the economy has been recovering. And now, as has been mentioned, I mean, there will be long-term scarring from the pandemic. Levels of poverty will take longer to recover than the macroeconomic numbers. There is this medium-term problem of losing a year's education, which will reinforce poverty and inequality. But if the politics were reasonable, I think the economy would come back reasonably quickly. Now, your question was, and I took it to be, if Pedro Castillo wins, how much of the kind of institutional structure of the economy would be lost? And it's a good question. I mean, the stability of the central bank has been crucial over the last 15 years. I mean, 15, 20 years. I mean, the sol is a more stable currency than the British pound, or it was until earlier this year, a lot more stable, actually. I think that would be at risk. I'm not sure about the free trade agreement with the US and the free trade agreement with China. I mean, those are harder to change and would be probably less motive for changing them. But I do think there's a risk that actually, with both of the candidates, that given the nature of the current Congress and the new Congress, and the desire to grab money and hand it out, then I think that would fairly soon start to undermine the solid economic institutional basis of Peruvian growth.
Great, thanks. We're going to take some of the questions now. We've gotten a lot of questions from participants. Again, please use the raise the hand function or send emails to meetings@dialogue.org. But let me start with a question I'd like to direct to Adriana from Cynthia McClintock, who asks if we can elaborate on the possible negative political effects of the pandemic on the campaign prior to the first round. Do you think it hurt more centrist candidates, perhaps by limiting campaigning, distorting the polls, and making it more difficult for Peruvians to talk with each other, come together behind a more centrist option?
Yes, thank you, Cynthia, for the question. And I would say, despite the lack of answers on how candidates will face the pandemic, either on the first round and either on the second round, I do think that the crisis has led people to choose for the most radical options available in the political offer. So I would say that voters are looking forward to candidates and leaders that are really, as we used to say in Spanish, mano dura, really authoritarian, really like more military led. In I would say in yes, inserting a cultural yes, the political culture of the Peru, that every time that we're in a crisis, we think that the military will resolve the crisis. So candidates who are more close to this authoritarian perspective have more options, I would say, have more, yes, they're more close to the electorate with this mano dura and with these radical options in terms of authority. So that's why we are also afraid for democracy, because as the poll Barómetro de las Américas said, the half of the Peruvian voters are ready to shift democracy for an authoritarian regime in case of crisis. So we're facing a really democratical crisis in terms of reliance of democracy. So that's how I see Cynthia's question.
Great, thank you. Alberto, we have a question from our friend Andres Rosenthal from Mexico, who asks about the influence and effect of Maria Vargas Llosa's position, seeing, supporting Keiko Fujimori, seeing her as a lesser of two evils. Does that have any impact, and how do you see Vargas Llosa's position in this election?
Yeah, I think it always has an impact. I mean, he's a major figure in politics in Peru, so it's undeniable that he has this this weight, right? To my view, I think something has started to sound here, but to my view, I think he did this too early, and especially he didn't ask enough guarantees to give Keiko Fujimori his support. He could have asked something in exchange of the support, and they, because I feel, I mean, he and his spoke people in the country, they didn't ask anything, and unfortunately, they not only didn't ask anything in exchange, but they have become sort of, I mean, Keiko Fujimori is flawless now. No risk is posed by her, and I feel that this is a problem regarding the future. I mean, we would need more, if you want, more critical supports, more supports with some distance. I mean, I'm not criticizing the fact that anyone, Vargas Llosa or anyone, supports Keiko Fujimori. I think it is legitimate to fear Pedro Castillo, as it is legitimate to fear a government by Keiko Fujimori. But what is problematic is when those endorsements come without a drop of criticism or putting the light on the big risk these two candidates carry. So that would be my sense. I think it's always important. It's Vargas Llosa's voice, of course, but under at least my view, they could have done this in a better way.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'll invite you if you want to, have any thoughts on the role of Vargas Llosa, but also wanted to ask you a question that we're getting a lot of questions about. About political trends in Latin America and how Peru might fit into that. And we know that inevitably, if Castillo wins next Sunday, we know that on, the following days, there'll be lots of articles written about, the return of the pink tide and move to the left in Latin America, and look at the results in Chile, Petro's strong standing and being in a good position to be, the next president in Colombia, the MAS in in Bolivia, Lula reemerging in Brazil, Fernandez. I'm wondering if you can comment, and of course Venezuela. What do you see as kind of, is this, would this be a new sort of leftist tide if Castillo wins? And should we look at it that way? Is that the most useful way to look at it? What does it mean, and how could we understand it compared to, the previous kind of swings towards the left in the region?
Right. Just quickly to answer, my answer to Andres Rosenthal's question would be, I'll tell you next week on the degree of Mario Vargas Llosa's influence in Peru. Yeah, I mean, I think if Castillo wins, there will be an awful lot of commentary that Latin America is moving back to the left. I mean, you have mentioned the possibility of Petro in winning next year in Colombia, of Lula in Brazil. Chile may throw up a president of the left and may throw up a constitution of the left. It's possible. There's a lot of discontent. I mean, an unprecedented level of discontent with the status quo. I mean, if we think of Peru 5 years ago, Humala won, representing in the second round reform of the model, not rupture. And now Castillo has almost 50% of the vote in the polls, standing for rupture, right? And that's a sign of change. But the overwhelming trends, I think, in Latin America are of anti-incumbency, and it's anti the status quo. People are angry, they want change. The pandemic's made that worse. In some cases, that can fall to the left. In other cases, it won't necessarily. And in the case of Colombia, I wouldn't write off the center. This, even though not yet, at any rate, because I think it will be an election about change, because I think the Duque government will be very unpopular. It is already, and it could be more so. But it may be a bit like the Peruvian election, in that there will be a large constituency who don't want leftist populism. I mean, the tragedy of Latin America at the moment is that is the relative absence of a reformist, democratic left, and the relative proliferation of populist authoritarian lefts. No? I mean, Chile may yet offer a reformist left. It could elect a right-wing president as well. So I mean, these things are not set in stone. I think the overwhelming political mood is opposition to the status quo. The political class is discredited, and that in Argentina, I think the opposition, the center-right opposition, will do well in the midterm election in October, and I think they'll probably win it. We shall see next weekend, next Sunday, not just the result of the Peruvian election, but the result of the very important midterm election in Mexico. And, will it consolidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador's hegemony, or will it actually start to weaken? So situation is kind of more fluid than some commentary allows, I think.
Great, thanks. Alberto, we have a question from Alan Riding. We haven't heard from him in a long time. It's good to hear from him, who says, I had the impression that part of the political problem comes from the inequality of the economic growth. Is that right or wrong?
It is, of course, part of the equation. It would be there was nonsense to try to rule out that. I mean, there are so many research done on that, on showing how inequality transforms in a way of voting. I mean, the maps that Adriana showed at the beginning of the presentation goes in that direction. Of course, I would say that also we should not exaggerate the impact of pandemics in having this second round, right? I mean, it's the third time that Keiko Fujimori is in a second round, so it's not the pandemic or this, which is driving this result. So, yeah, I don't think we can translate directly. I mean, there are so many. It's not only, for example, something that I feel was important in this campaign in the last month or month and a half was the debate that happened in Chota in Cajamarca, which is something important. I mean, then there you can see that it's not only an economic issue what is at stake here. I mean, there is a level of a need of recognition of presence in the public sphere of a part of the country that feels that is out of the equation. And they know that the only reason why debate like that is organized in a small town like Chota is because Pedro Castillo is in the second round. And they know that the day that Pedro Castillo disappeared, lose the election, Chota will not hold a new debate. So it's not only inequality in terms of the Gini indicator, but also the inequality of a way of how the whole country, the whole public sphere is structured. And that's something I think important to go beyond, not only is the inequality in economic terms, but in political, symbolical, institutional ways, right?
Great. Adriana,
Yes.
Adriana, please.
Thank you. I didn't know if you were looking my.
Yes, I was watching. Yeah, I'm watching.
So I wanted to add something on what Alberto said and what I previously said, that I think for people who hasn't followed what's going on in Peru for the 5 past years, it is important to say that both parties that arrived to the second round did political work, what we call political work. I mean, explaining Castillo's arrival to the second round could be explained on how he has come to join 3 networks that has given him some political credits. The first one is Las Rondas Campesinas. It's a local-based vigilance community system in Cajamarca that he has belonged for many years. The second network is the teachers network, since he was a leader on 2017 teachers strike. And the third network is Peru Libre, which is the party that he has invited him to be a political, a presidential candidate. So the superposition of these 3 networks has led him to have some political capital that no other parties have, especially because they are parties based in Lima. So I think this is important to explain not only how the Lima press has explained this victory as a surprise, but I also think that there is political work behind him, and I think it's important to say that. And for Keiko, as Alberto said, it's the 3rd time that she's running for president, so she also has like a political structure that we could speak on, a party that works more as an entourage, as a constellation, more than like a strong party in terms of what we know on parties worldwide. But I think this political capital has led both candidates to run to the second round more easily than other candidates that were running for the first time, that has no national network, that are based in Lima, that were, I wouldn't say weak, because I think every candidature is weak, but I will say the political work has to be taken in account.
Great, that's really useful. Just I can ask a quick follow-up to you. When did Castillo sort of appear on your radar as somebody who follows? In other words, did you see this surge, or was this, I mean, it seems to have come just in the last month or so before the first round, but.
Yes, but he has been on the, I would say, not like for many years, but in 2017, he was like the principal leader of the
Right.
national strike that led the schools for a month without classes. So he
Right.
has like power gained there. And like I would say all over this year, he has been on the newspaper and has been on the Congress and has been having contact with the political class. So I would say 2017, 2018, and then the last year, but we were not looking the campaign. I mean, I live in Lima, so I follow like Lima press, and also I try to follow some like other region news, but I think the mainstream media didn't cover very well what's going on other regions. So we have the lack of information. So it always appears a surprise because we never take into account what's going on in other parts than the capital.
That's exactly the fundamental problem, no? The wide chasm that exists and that has existed in Peru for a long time, and that I think accounts for a lot of what's going on. Adriana, Alberto, Mike, thank you so much. It's been a terrifically illuminating discussion about a very complex situation, and we'll be following what happens the next couple of days, and of course what happens next Sunday. And all we can do, I think we've identified some of the concerns and risks based on good information and good analysis. But we'll hope that things are, are peaceful and as democratic as possible, and that the country clearly has been ravaged by the pandemic, is in very bad shape, and needs an effective government to be able to address the serious problems. And we all hope for given all of the possible scenarios, I think all of us are wishing for the best one. So we'll be watching closely, and we hope we can get some of you back for future discussions about developments in Peru. And I want to thank all of you for taking time and sharing your insights with us, and also for the participants. We had many participants on this call who clearly are watching very closely and are very concerned, and for your good questions to our expert speakers. So thanks very much. Stay well, and all the best. And we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much, and take good care.
Michael.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Mike, for the
Thanks.
invitation.